Frank Strang, MBE, who is the Chief Executive of Saxavord Spaceport, which is a vertical spaceport being established in the Shetland Isles. Mr. Strang is a former RAF pilot, and he's joined by another former RAF pilot, Dave Balance, who is the Launch Operations Manager at the Saxavord Spaceport, a position that he's had since March 2020. Thank you very much indeed for coming and for coming in person. Perhaps you could just tell us how things are going and when you expect the first launch to take place from your spaceport.
Certainly, Chairman. Just a small point of order, otherwise I'll get a hard time from my pilot friends. I wasn't a pilot, unfortunately, fortunately, but I was an Air Force officer. So
I see, you're an officer.
So another point I'd like to make is Saxavord, we're not just about vertical launch. It's very important to understand that what we're building is a spaceport, so I need diversity of income and we need to build a sustainable business. So our business model is based about launch, bringing down the data from the satellites, and also accommodation and support services. So we're not reliant on one thing. To date, we got planning permission on the 23rd of March last year. Since then, we've spent £28 million of our money. We have built new roads. We've crafted out 3 launch pads. We've laid the concrete and steel for Launch Pad 1, Launch Pad Fredo, which is the first new vertical orbital launch site in Europe. One of our clients, Rocket Factory Augsburg, have erected their launch stool, about €13 million worth of infrastructure on our site. One of our other clients, who you're talking to later, High Impulse, have conducted, I think it's their 7th successful engine test on site in the last 3 years. Over the course of the next couple of months, we've got High Impulse doing engine testing. We've got a French company today from Paris testing engines, and Rocket Factory will be doing their stage 1 and 2 testing in July. We've built our first ground stations on Shetland, and we're taking down data as we speak. So we're actually an operational spaceport. We've just secured a £139 million debt facility from the markets, which will allow us to drive forward. Yes, there's a lot going on. 80 employees as well today from 4 6 years ago.
Very good. And I think it's the case that you're privately funded. Have you received any public funds from any of the public bodies?
That's a sore point. We've fought and bit and scratched our way to where we are now. To be fair to the Space Agency, just before Christmas we secured a small grant to build a launch rail to support our suborbital launches. But all the monies we've spent to date have been private funds.
And it's the case that in the Cornwall spaceport and the Sutherland spaceport, both of them have had government grants of one form or another.
All the other prospective spaceports have had public sector funding. It's a sore point. We've gone, but what I would point out is that we are very close, to our first launch. We've created a siege mentality. It's been painful, and there's always a balance. Public sector funding can slow you down, but unless you secure public sector funding, nobody believes that you're actually real. I wouldn't say no now. What I would throw out a challenge to government is you match us pound for pound, and look at all the initiatives that we're putting out there from our STEM. Our STEM programme, for example, I know that's very close to government. 2 months ago, we had 250,000 children sign up to our online STEM lessons. That's pretty cool. 7,000 from Liverpool alone, from all over the world. And again, we've funded that privately.
Before I go to my colleagues, just tell us why Shetland, and not just in Shetland, you're in the northernmost island of the British Isles, you're in Unst. I assume that there's a geographical reason for that.
I'll let Dave answer that in a minute, but what I will say is that space is about geography, maths and physics, and the geography doesn't lie. I will also say that space bookends the United Kingdom from Shetland in the north to Cornwall in the south, when we've got a spine of space activity down the middle. But I'll let my colleague answer that question.
Tell us why the geography of Shetland is significant.
There's 2 reasons. When you break it down to the basics. The first one is the type of orbits that we will be targeting with the launch vehicles that we will be using. The further north you are, the better. So northerly latitude is good. And the second thing is we have a very clear area to launch into. So we are on the peninsula in the far northeast corner of Unst. We will be looking to launch towards the north, and above us we have a large sea tract. So from a safety point of view, it's a very safe place to launch. Those are the two fundamental reasons why it's a good place to launch from.
I see. Thank you. And obviously, as the launch operations manager, you'll be having a close view of the technology and a lot of its new technology. How confident are you that it's ready? Is it ready, or has it got some way to go before it's ready for deployment and launch?
The technology is ready on the whole, but obviously each new launch vehicle manufacturer who comes along has a development process that they need to get through. So does the technology exist already today to utilise our spaceport? Yes, but we've also got new players approaching us.
Good. So my colleagues have got some questions about the licensing and the regulatory process. So we'll start with Stephen Metcalfe on that.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for setting that up nicely. Where are we with the licensing process for the spaceport?
Let David answer that one.
Right. My primary job at the moment is working the spaceport licence. We are also actively pursuing a range licence. Our colleague Jimmy Slaughter is running that. He's not here today, so I will talk to the spaceport licence. We submitted it through the CAA portal in March of 22. We are currently working through some RFIs for that. Sorry?
You're working through some
requests for information.
Thank you.
So we've submitted the documents we needed to submit, and we're going through iterations to answer questions from the CAA. So the latest round of requests for information, we've got about half the stuff back to them. And that's about it, really. That's probably a good starting point.
Okay. And so you're in this process. Presumably it's a relatively new process across the whole UK. How are you finding that process, and when would you expect to receive a licence?
Right, the process, I think it's fair to say from our perspective, got off to a slow start, which was March last year. This is the first vertical launch spaceport licence in process, and it's definitely a learning process on both sides for ourselves, because we don't have a metric to compare ourselves to in the UK. We have other metrics around the world we can compare ourselves to, but in terms of the UK regulations, it's new. So from my perspective, I would say we got off to a slow start, but we have a very good relationship with the space regulation team, and we are progressing the licence well at the minute. In terms of when do I think the licence is going to come out, I don't know the answer to that. I'll let Frank take what he would like to happen.
Yes.
But in terms of when we will get a licence, difficult question.
I think the country needs a licensed vertical launch spaceport sooner rather than later. It can have conditions, and you need checks and balances. And as David said, it's new for both parties. But every country in the world has got a space economy, and they all want to be part of this space race. And it's moving very, very, very quickly. And if you look at, I bang on about this, but this is how quickly aerospace and space is moving. On the 17th of December 1903 was the first manned flight. 68 years later, only 68 years later, man walked on the moon. On the 22nd of December 2022, up in Unst, we completed our first launch pad. That's 100 years. It's moving very quickly. So we need to work with the regulator to ensure and show the world that we're open for business, because there's lots of young companies that want to come here.
Okay. Thank you for that, and I appreciate the points you said about sooner rather than later. But in terms of, is not having a licence in place acting as a barrier yet? And when would you like to have a licence? Obviously as soon as possible, but realistically, are you talking about 3 months, 6 months, a year?
I would like to see a licence in 3 months. Is it acting as a barrier? No, because we're working on concurrent activity all the time. But that's because we're privately funded and I've got to drive forward. But also, I think what this committee needs to understand is that the industry is moving so quickly, and there's lots of young companies out there that are driving, and they're all at a stage with their R&D and development that the water's coming to the top of the dam, and they're all going to be looking to build their businesses more or less within 6 months to a year of each other. So we need to be ready, but we need to be regulated and we need to be safe, because the last thing we need, things will go wrong.
Yeah.
So I get this balance. So to answer your question, 3 months, please.
A licence in 3 months won't hamper the business. Longer than that, it would start to have an impact on our viability as a space nation.
I think so.
Thank you.
And are the CAA apprised of the need to accommodate that timetable if it's safe to do so?
Yeah, and the CAA, it's very easy to beat the CAA up. And, you know, we've been, as David said, we got onto a slow start. And, you know, I'm the guy that had them up against the wall. They understand, you know, but they've got a job to do. What if government can give them discretion? So we live in this world where everyone's got to be, and it's a blame society, as you guys and ladies know only too well. Give them some discretion, but to work within the rules. But they're fully aware of the requirement. What I will say, however, going back to your earlier statement, Chairman, is because all the other spaceports are publicly funded. A lot of the launch companies have got large tranches of public sector support. They're happy to just to plod along. And so, you know, the CAA can only go along at the pace of what they're being asked to do. We're a bit different. You know, we're in this new space economy, and and it's very difficult for a regulator and a civil service department to start to move at pace. But they are aware, and they're trying. I've got to say, they are trying.
Thank you. So Graham String has got some related questions.
Can I show my ignorance? Dave, I didn't understand why the launch has to be further north. The Earth's more or less a sphere, isn't it? Why does it make any difference where you launch from?
It's to do with the orbits that you can access, and the easiest way to explain that is think of a sky satellite dish on the side of your house, and it points quite low down because it's pointing at a satellite which is in an equatorial orbit. And the best place to launch those is the traditional big places like French Guiana, Cape Canaveral, places that are close to the equator. For a low Earth orbit, where the satellite is much closer to the Earth, they run north-south. So because of the spin of the Earth, the closer north you've got, the less penalty there is. Whereas for a equatorial launch, you're taking advantage of the speed of rotation of the Earth. So it's physics.
I think I'm closer to understanding it. Thank you. Are the regulations for spaceports separate from the regulations for space flight?
Yes, as in the different licenses that are available. The ones that we're concentrating on is the spaceport license and the range service provision license. Then you need a launch operator's license to do a launch. You need a return operator's license to bring something back from orbit to Earth. And then you've got an on-orbit license as well.
Right. And are those regulations, the two separate sets of regulations, are they fit for purpose?
Okay, it's one set of regulations that covers everything. That's a difficult question. Are we working our way through them, and have we presented a license application to the CAA that meets the requirements of the space industry regulations? I believe we have. Could they be better? Probably, but because of the time issue, we've got to work with what we have, and I'm confident that we can get our licenses approved using the existing regulations.
When we had previous witnesses, they told us that the regulations would likely to stop investment, certainly in Cornwall. You don't think they're a hindrance to investment?
I would suggest there were other agendas from those witnesses. I saw some of the regulations are the regulations, and are they fit for purpose? Could they do with tweaking? Could they do? Probably yes. But this is the first stab. Cornwall got its license, you know, if that's what we're alluding to. They got their range license. The technology failed, not the spaceport. So, and it's important from our perspective. It's about the agility and the speed of getting to that point, so that our clients can come in. But I can't see how and our clients. I said this. I was in a meeting in Whitehall 2 weeks ago, and I said to the politician, go and talk to our clients, the French company that are testing their engines, the 2 German clients, the Americans. They're not coming to us because we tell nice jokes and they want to see Shetland ponies. They're coming because the UK is the right place to be and we have something to offer. There are regulations everywhere. There's regulations in Germany, the DLR. But we've got 2 German companies testing engines in our spaceport right now. So it's very easy to hide behind the regulations. It's how you approach solving them and putting a team in place. We have a team of 8 working full time on our licensing process. It costs money, but most of them, unlike me, are ex-RAF pilots, and they're working their way through it.
I would not be doing my job properly if I didn't ask you what the agendas were.
Well, I'm not close enough to it, but if you look at what the outcome was, it looked as if that company was running out of money, and they were looking to blame the government for, it looked to me on the outside looking in. The launch happened, the technology failed. Don't blame the licensor, don't blame the UK government for that. They got it away, and if you're not into risk, don't get into the space industry. Manage the messaging. Look what happened with SpaceX just recently. How they managed that messaging brilliantly. We know 80% of your first launches are going to fail, but eventually your cadence will build up, and the rockets will leave like buses. So just tell the truth.
Right. You've been very positive about the role of the CAA as the regulator. There must have been some difficulties. This is a new and complicated process about health and safety. And what have been the biggest problems?
I'll answer that one.
Feel free to start off.
Well, from at my level, because Dave's right in amongst the weeds. Initially, I think it's an understanding of the marketplace. There's old space and there's new space. Old space is the guys with the blue suits and the white shirts. New space is the 14-year-old with a PhD who's an international, very bright young man or woman, and these are the people who are in a hurry. And I think the CA came into this from a standing start. Traditionally, we've looked at the BAEs and the Boeings and all these big aerospace companies, trying to get under the skin of these young companies who have raised lots of money, who are in a hurry, because remember, it's all about satellite technology, it's all about the mobile phone. And I think, it took time for the CA to try to get under the skin of the sector. I genuinely believe they're trying now, and some of them are behind us here. And as one of them reminded me, it was only 3 years ago I had one of them up against the wall saying you're not listening. I genuinely believe that they are listening. The other thing is, to be fair to the CAA, I'm probably not allowed to swear on television, but there's so many smoking mirrors around this industry. And I say it's like, if I ask, I don't know if you ski, Chairman, but if I ask you, do you ski, you'll say I've skied for 40 years. What you mean, you've only skied for a week a year for 40 years. It's like men playing golf. And the space industry is full of promises. And the CAA initially would have listened to these companies saying, we're going to launch in the summer of 22, we're going to launch in the spring of 23. But they didn't really know. And so there's a learning process both sides. What I would counsel is that the space industry is not new. They've been doing it in America for a long time, safely. They've done it in Russia, So, take the lessons learned from those other space nations. And again, the CA have been working with the FAA, and they've actually helped us work with the FAA. So, I never thought I'd say this 3 years ago, or after 3 years, but I can't fault them. I genuinely can't fault them. I can fault the lack of support that we've had as a spaceport, from government. I can show the monies that we've invested, that we've got a 3-dimensional spaceport, that we're doing all these initiatives around by ourselves, but I can't fault the regulator, genuinely. Do you want to say that?
Sorry.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of comments. From our point of view for the licensing, we very deliberately have tried to keep the licensing knowledge within our company. We're not contracting it out. So I think there's a large amount of knowledge base in the UK that we need to build. So we're trying to keep that within our own company so we know going forward when we need to change things, how to change things. I think it's fair to say that from the CA's point of view, they're learning as well, in the same way that we are, and it's building that knowledge base. And I think as we've started the licensing process, that knowledge base hasn't been there probably as much as it should be on either side. So our plan is to keep that knowledge in the company. How the CA is managing that, I don't know, but we are definitely seeing more individuals on the teams that we're engaging with on specific areas, and my hope would be that knowledge base is retained and expanded.
My last question. The process has got better. I think that would be a fair summary of what you're saying. How could it be improved further?
For us, speed. It is difficult with the requests for information on technical matters. It takes time for us to work those through, give it back to the CAA, let the CAA work through it and assess whether we've answered the question that they asked. That's where it comes into the knowledge base. Do we have the people who can work that quickly? And do we have enough people working on it? And it cuts both ways. Obviously, we've got a team. We've split out the range team from the Spaceport team to streamline that internally. And certainly, it's getting better as we go along.
Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. You both mentioned the regulations and said that they might be able to be tweaked. Obviously, these regulations were put in anticipation of launch in the UK, and it would be pretty likely that in practice you discover things that you wish you'd known at the time. Are there any particular respects that you think the regulations, without criticising them, in anticipation didn't capture what you're now experiencing?
I'll let Dave answer that. The one thing I would say is that when and this is in our opinion, when the regulations were first crafted, they weren't expecting a spaceport up in the north of Shetland to have a multi-use site, and the regulations were probably crafted looking at a one-user, one-pad spaceport, and I think there's had to be some adjustment there. David, have you want?
No, that I think summarises it best. That's where we run into difficulties, trying to explain our concept of operations. Because we have a good launch site, we have a lot of available trajectories where the launch vehicles can go. So building the safety case for that is quite difficult, and I don't think the regs necessarily help us with that. But I think that's the single biggest overarching comment. I'll stop there.
If I could just add, Chairman, is that, and this aligns to regulation, and this is not a criticism, but this is just fact, and if you go on the website, tied to regulation is the commercial viability of that business. Okay, so the Cornwall Spaceport is licensed for 2 launches a year with one user. Now that user fails, sadly it did, and we were rooting for Cornwall to succeed. 2 launches a year doesn't make for a commercial spaceport. It just can't. It just doesn't. And if that end user fails, then you've neutered your spaceport. You've got to look at what will make that spaceport sustainable. I have an obligation, not just to shareholders, but to communities and to the country, to make sure that we are a viable spaceport 30 years from now. I get letters from 8-year-old girls looking for jobs in space. Such is the interest in the economy. So align the regulation to the commercial viability of the spaceport, and then you've got a long-term industry. Don't look for one-hit wonders.
Thank you very much, Dick. Carol Monaghan.
Thank you. Frank, you've mentioned a few times this morning the lack of funding or lack of public funding. Could you give us some reasons why you have been unsuccessful in that?
Oh, well, both governments, and both Scottish and we came to the party late. There was you haven't got time for the whole story. You need to read the book, and we are doing a Netflix series. we weren't taken seriously. Government was looking at publicly funded sites in the UK, and we came in 2 years later. What I would say is that we got our planning permission a year ago, 2 years after another site, and we're almost finished. So I just didn't think we were taken seriously. Shetland's out there, but the Shetland economy is based on its geography, as you know, oil and gas, renewables, aquaculture, fishing, now space. And I just don't think anyone took us seriously. And as government, when government goes down, it's like a supertanker. When it goes down a line, to shift that supertanker, it takes a lot. Had we got the public funding, we'd be ready now. Trust me. And we are. Well, I'd like to invite the whole committee to come up and visit. I think, a picture. What I say is use us as the exemplar. Back success, because if we're successful up there, the rest will filter all the way back down. And then if you get Cornwall working, we can meet in the middle. But we've got a lot going on. So there's a lot. Happy to talk offline, Carol, about it.
I remember a number of years ago there was a prominent MSP, he was a Tory MSP, I'm not going to name him, but he talked about Scotland's ambitions in space being science fiction, which went across the front page of the papers, and he caused quite a lot of upset. Do you think part of the issue is that people still don't look at the UK as a viable player here?
You've hit the nail on the head. I don't remember, I never saw that one, otherwise I'd be with you shouting. Okay, so we've got a pilot here. My background's in physical education. If somebody had told me in 1976 when I went to the Scottish School of PE, or 1983 when I went to the Royal Air Force College Cranwell, I'd be building a spaceport on Shetland, I'd said, you're smoking rope. What am I doing building a spaceport? And when we started this journey 5 years ago, my colleague Scott, who spoke to you the last time, we really didn't understand. We genuinely didn't understand. We know a lot about aviation and defence. And as we've walked the streets of Europe and America and met these 17-year-olds with PhDs and get the letters from the young kids, worked with the high impulses of this world and the RFAs, we've realised the size of this economy. And to me, genuinely, it's like a new industrial revolution. But I think you're absolutely right. People didn't believe. And sometimes up there in Shetland, when I briefed the Shetland Island Council 4 years ago, I started off by saying this is not an April Fool, right? And because we just didn't know. But now, you need to understand we're not selling ourselves to these companies that are coming to us. They're coming because the geography, the maths, and the physics works. And in Scotland has the ability to be a genuine space nation. But the UK, somebody asked me a couple of weeks ago, where do we sit in the league table? I think we're halfway up the championship. We're not in the Premier League. We have the ability, if you look at what's going on with our education system and our manufacturers, certainly in the central belt of Scotland and in Surrey, to be in the Premier League. But we need to, we really need to move quickly and aggressively, but we can. So I agree with you.
Thank you. Can I ask a couple of questions? You've said two launches a year is not financially viable. What are you looking at?
We're at 30. So our licence application is for 30 launches. At the moment,
Weekly?
It's virtually, yeah.
And will it be season dependent? Will it be more in the summer?
That's another very good question. So as you will be well aware, Shetland's way up there in the north. And we got 10 years worth of Met data on the winds, for example, in Shetland. And to launch, you need 3 hours of 30 knots or less of wind. From spring to the autumn, believe it or not, 95% of days have 3 hours, could be 3 in the morning, of course, of suitable winds. And in the winter, it's 1 day and 3. So yeah, we can achieve that. Based on the discussions we're having with our clients, I think eventually we'll be going back into the CAA to get an extension to 40 or 50 slots. But again, Carl, it's very important. We're not wholly reliant on launch. We're bringing down data, and we've also got a tourism element to what we're doing as well. So if for some reason launch is delayed, we've got revenues coming in from elsewhere.
I think certainly some members of the committee would be very keen to take you up on your offer to see it, and I think it would be useful for us to kind of see what's going on in the site. Can you tell me how many companies you're planning to be working with on your 30 launches a year?
Well, today, I was talking to the CA earlier, Launchpad 1 is gone, it's contracted to a German company called Rocket Factory Augsburg.
That's for their
That's for
exclusive
their,
use?
Yep. We've got High Impulse, so we've got 9 international companies that we're working with on launch, and we're working with 3 on data. So, and they've all come to us, I stress, and they're from Germany, France, Italy, India, Turkey, and America, obviously.
Moving on, thank you. Moving on, a couple of questions just about support. Is there anything else that the CAA or the government could be doing in order to support the industry?
Do you want to talk about regulation on that, and I'll talk about...
I think we've kind of already talked the regulation piece through. I don't think I've got anything more to add to that.
I think the problem that government has is you need to spread your net wide. You've got to be seen to be company agnostic. I would say you need to start backing winners, because if the winners win, the rest will spread out. I think you're trying to be all things to all men, and it's not quite working. And sometimes, you know, government tries to put projects in places for political reasons rather than for practical reasons. And I think they just need to change. But, you know, if you look at it, you know, our education, you know, STEM's been promoted big time. We're looking at climate change. We're looking to build a space environmental climate and control centre up in Shetland. So we can use that data, you know, well, so I think all the government initiatives are there. Maybe what you should look at, and I never thought I'd say this, is if it was me, there's too many organisations, there's too many membership organisations. I would be appointing, let's call it a space czar, but not somebody with the usual DNA from the same gene pool. Somebody that understands new space, old space, defence, the internationalism of it. Somebody who understands the way the regulations work. Pull it together, because we've got, you know, as I say, the wave's coming up on the UK, and we're in a great place. But if we're not careful, we will, you know, we'll lose out.
I mean, I was actually just about to ask you, one of the piece of evidence we heard at our last session was that sometimes there's too many different things and people don't quite know. There seems to be a lack of coordination across that.
Totally agree.
So, so some sort of portal that people can go where regulations are understood, where licensing's understood, that would make things...
Yes, is the short answer to that. We've talked a lot about regs and we've talked about licences. But those are only the licences that are required under the Space Industries Act. There are also other licences, marine licences, etc., etc. So for us to encourage people to come and launch from us, we've got to make it simpler. It's quite complicated with the number of bodies that have to be engaged.
It's complicated for you because you're having to learn about all these different agencies. Is it difficult for the agencies as well to work with each other?
Yes, because we're new. And I'll throw an example out there, for example, COMA. You know, it exists for control of major accident hazards, so major industrial facilities like a petroleum facility or something. We will come under that because of the quantities of materials we're going to have on the site, but no one's ever done that before for a spaceport in the UK. So once we've got it done, it'll be done, that's great, and that's not something that a potential customer would deal with. But for a customer coming to us, we go, yeah, you need to get a SIA license. They go, that's great, how do we do it? But there's all these other things that have to go with it, and I think that's where it needs to be a bit more joined up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. Just to complete the picture on the CAA, you've, as Graham says, you've given a positive review of your experience of them improving over time. One of the things that we heard was that establishing space within the CAA was going to be dominated by the civil aviation, and they may not have enough people. What's your experience in terms of the attention you've had from individuals? Have you had to kind of wait in a queue, or do you think they've got enough resource? I suppose it's probably Mr. Barnes that takes the most.
As I said earlier, we got off to a slow start. From our perspective, it did feel like stuff was going into the CAA and not coming back. Some of that is due to the licensing process, because it's very much to get from the initial screen through to the assessment phase, the process is set up that everything has to go at the same time. So, for example, we ended up with one particular area that we had to revisit several times. All the other stuff that was ready, from our perspective, wasn't being assessed. Now, whether it could have been assessed at that time, I don't know. So from the outside, the process is slow to get going. Part of that is the way the process is set up. Whether that's also due to resource is within the CA, I don't know. Certainly at the moment, my engagement directly with the teams within the CA, I'm seeing more people there. So from my perspective, I am seeing more resources on the CAA side. And at the moment, we seem to be ticking along quite nicely. Okay.
I think it takes time to build that resource. And coming back to the speed of movement of this industry, I suspect within the CAA, they didn't realise how fast this sector was going to move and how important it would be. As again, I'm trying to be fair. Being cynical, I would also say that probably a lot of that resource was pointed towards Cornwall, quite rightly, to get that away. But I would also point out that the stats, the FAA, only 10% of launches will be horizontal. The other 90% will be vertical, so ourselves and Orbex and Sutherland, etc. So how does the CA manage that resource? But it takes time to find them, to get them trained up. And I keep saying we're in a hurry, because we have to be, and the system sometimes can't move that quickly. But it's probably sound because they're behind us just now with guns pointed at us that we're being nice about them. But trust me, we're being very, we're being pretty pragmatic. We have no issues at the moment.
Thank you. And just finally, you mentioned you made an interesting recommendation that there should be a space and satellite czar to kind of pull everything together. In the absence of that, there is a UK government national space strategy that was published in September 2021. Is that a document that that you engage with? Is it a helpful thing? Is it meaningful to you?
You want the honest truth?
Yeah.
No.
Right. Because
I don't think, going back to fit for purpose, it's like when the consultation went out before for the regulations, we all, not just us, but everyone inputted, but none of our recommendations were accepted, which was a very poor starting point. I keep coming back to, this industry is about the high impulses, the RFAs, the Orbexes, these young companies coming through. You've all got your mobile phones in front of you. It's all about satellite technology. The mobile phone is the sixth gun of the 21st century. It controls our lives, but it changes. You change your phone every couple of years. So our space strategy needs to move with the times. However, again, with the sad state of affairs with the world order has changed. The Ukraine has changed a lot of people's attitudes to space. The future wars are going to be, unfortunately, up there in space. Everything needs to be pulled together, and I would say take a more holistic overview of space. But go back to the young people. I'm 65. I was 65 last week. What am I doing here building a spaceport? It's because these young people are driving us. And trust me, Chairman, I wouldn't have come all the way from Shetland today. We've spent £27 million in a year building a spaceport. I wouldn't be doing that unless we believed in this sector.
Well, it's very clear you do, and we're very grateful that you've both of you made the journey from Shetland to join us today. So can I thank Mr Strang, Mr Balance for your evidence today. And I'm going to introduce the next panel of witnesses.
Sure, come and see us.
Yes, please.
Yes.
Thank you. I think we look forward to Absolutely. So let me invite our next pair of witnesses, and they are Dr. Mario Cobalt, who is the Chief Executive Officer of High Impulse Technologies, who have been referred to already. High Impulse are a German company that's developing a small launch system for small satellites. Welcome and thank you. Do we have the labels for our witnesses? Yes. Yeah, sorry. And Jonas Beanu, who is appearing virtually, I think, if the screen, there we are, in perfect time. Mr. Beanu is the Chief Technology Officer of Orbex, which is developing a low-carbon orbital micro-launch system and is intended to make use of the proposed Sutherland spaceport. And Mr. Beanu worked previously at Denmark's National Space Institute. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for joining us today. Perhaps I could just ask with a basic question, perhaps starting with Dr. Cobbold, for you to describe what your business does, what your technology does, and how close it is to fruition.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me today. So High Impulse is a new space startup. We've been founded in 2018 in Germany, and we are working on sounding rockets and small launchers, which is based on our special technology that we are using, which is called hybrid rocket propulsion. And this gives us some nice competitive advantages, and we've been demonstrating the technology, the founders of High Impulse, already as students, and now we are working on preparing for the first launch actually this year. So testing rocket motors in general is not easy from regulation and also from the whole operation itself, and we had actually difficulties doing this in Germany at large scale. So that's when we have met actually the colleagues from Spaceport already 2 or 3 years ago, and we've been looking for a possibility to do engine testing, but also of course looking for a future launch site. So that's when our collaboration started, and they enabled us to start doing our test campaigns in Shetland Islands. And since then, in the last 2 years or so, we have done already 8 test campaigns for the development of our rocket motors. And now, just some weeks ago in April, we had the last successful campaign, which basically now shows that the technology is fully ready to do a first launch together with Spaceport actually this October.
Good, thank you. And what made you attracted to the UK and Shetland in particular? Presumably you looked at other places before deciding on Shetland.
Yeah, I think it was explained already a bit before. Of course, there is just technical restrictions on the place where you can launch. So in Europe, actually, there's not so many places. There's some other launch sites for us, for example, in Sweden or Norway. But then in UK, basically, from the technical requirements, also Shetland Islands is the best place from a geographical point of view also. And also the collaboration together with Spaceport has been pretty nice all the time, and they operate also like us as a startup and try to move and get things done and work efficiently, and that's an important point to succeed also.
Thank you. Let me turn to our other witness, and I didn't introduce him as Dr. Biano, but I understand that, not surprisingly in this sector, he's also a PhD. So, Dr. Biano, tell us a bit about your company and why you've chosen Sutherland as the place to target launch.
Yes, thank you very much also for having me today. So, Orbix is probably best described as a combination of the two witnesses you've just heard evidence from. So basically, Orbix is an end-to-end solution delivering both a launch vehicle and a spaceport solution to facilitate operations of that launch vehicle. We were founded in 2016, and we went at the problem to develop a clean sheet type launch system. So we had the opportunity to choose solutions freely with no a priori commitments to technology. And for that reason, we ended up with a system that is fully propelled by a green propellant, so a biopropellant, quite uniquely in this sector. And we found essentially a system solution that enabled us to operate that from a very minimalistic spaceport located in the Highlands region near Shetland, also near the Sutherland Amoyne Peninsula. As to your question as why we chose that specific location, really our journey started quite early in 2016, And at that point in time, we looked at various options for launch. In Europe, there were not many to choose from. Basically, at that stage, we only had Kourou in South America as an option. And S-Range and Andoya had aspirational thoughts, but beyond that, there weren't really any. And we were looking, of course, you are trading a lot of different metrics, but our system is a so-called micro-launcher, and one of the important metrics there is proximity. So physically having your systems located closely to each other, your test facilities, your production facilities, your launch and operations facilities. Simply as a cost saving measure, and therefore a way to build a sustainable business case. And then the real game changer for us came with the combination of the Space Industry Act in 2018 and the Launch UK program initiation around that point in time, which enabled us, together with Highlands and Islands Enterprise and Lockheed Martin at that time, to field a combined proposal for the Sutherland Spaceport and for us to set up a permanent presence in the UK.
Thank you on that. So you've chosen Sutherland. When do you expect construction of the spaceport at Sutherland to be complete?
So we have in fact broken ground in Sutherland just earlier this month. This project is a 10-month effort to field the initial capability, and then we will be moving our launch furniture, so to speak, onto the launch site in the period that follows this. So we should achieve an operational capability second half of 2024.
Thank you very much, Lee. I'm going to turn to my colleagues for some questions, starting with Dawn Butler and then Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Rano, thank you very much. It sounds really great that you've got this low carbon launch system. I don't know what that means, but it sounds futuristic. I just wonder, when do you expect Sutherland Spaceport to receive its spaceport license?
So at this point in time, we are working very closely together with the CAA to prepare our license application here for, and then we will expect that to pass through CAA with the cadence that they currently project to be on the order of a year. So our submission is currently due for June, and then the license issuance about a year from there. And naturally, that is subject to the application flow.
You don't see any issues or problems with that license at all? You think that would be quite straightforward?
So we put in our launch vehicle license application in February last year. And of course, we, being an end-to-end solution, have to cater to both the launch service provider license and the launch site operator's license, so both facets of it. And this has been a good process so far together with the CAA. We expect the same level of collaboration that we've had with them to continue. And of course, I mean, all of this will be guided by the safety case and the analysis that goes into this. So I mean, an engineer by heart, so I don't expect anything to be problem-free ever. But I mean, I would expect this to be the simpler of the two applications that we have to cater to, if I can put it like that.
Thank you. And just with the CAA, how does your relationship or your experience with them differ from other regulatory agencies?
Well, I mean, we can say that Orbix really, from the UK side, engages primarily with the CAA as the regulatory body. I will say initially, when we started the process on the launch license application for the vehicle back a year ago, we were off to a somewhat slow start and a somewhat sluggish interaction with them. This has picked up tremendously over the course of the last 7, 8, 9 months. And we are now on a regular meeting cadence with them. We have face-to-face meetings on a regular basis. They are site visiting us, or we had a site visit 3 weeks ago. We have a follow-up meeting today. So overall, I think we have a solid working relationship and a good, I mean, very competent technical engagement with them, I find.
Thank you. And to both of you, just lastly, just as our understanding of the CAA, do you think there's anything more that they could do? Would you like them to work in a different way? Is there anything that you would like to add around that?
Dr.
Biano
Biano first.
Dr. Biano first.
Oh, no, sorry. Yes. I mean, we clearly see that the licensing process is developing. We wouldn't expect anything else. We always viewed this as a tete-a-tete between them and us, because we are developing a vehicle and they're developing a process for issuing a license towards that vehicle at the same time. So there are elements where we've seen some discrepancy between what was required by the regulation and what was needed by the CAA to implement that. And we have had some issues with clarity in that regard. They have been able to provide that as we go along, as the engagement has matured. So I think the key issue for us is always the time it takes for a feedback loop, the time it takes for an engagement. So the quicker we are able to turn around questions and answers, basically the quicker we are able to progress to a solid implementation of the license. And this is really our desire. We are a startup, just as the other elements on your panel, so we are very time conscious as to anything that we do.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Capold, to you too, the CAA, is there anything that you think that you would like them to do differently?
Yeah, maybe first of all, I think the interactions have been very positive overall, and they have also been open to feedback that we provided them and that they also implemented. Maybe as general introduction, we have a suborbital flight license pending currently with the CAA under the ANO, and the second suborbital flight and future orbital flights are planned under the CIA. The process has taken quite a bit of time under the ANO license, which we have been told that it would work actually faster than the CIA, and I think it's clear that it's a new topic also for CAA, and they approach the safety margins, for example, probably more conservative than FAA. And
great, brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Chair. So it's clear that the ambition of the UK is to be a successful space nation. There's a lot of activity going on, but we heard in our last session that there is potentially the need for more coordination and more sense of purpose and direction and urgency. The idea of a space czar was floated. There was discussion about creating a single point of contact for licensing and applications. What are your views on that? What interventions, what more can the UK do, whether it's the CAA, the government, other government agencies do to help us meet our ambitions?
I would say probably the most important part would be to be flexible to adapt the airspace for launching. So currently for us it looks like there are very short launch windows possible due to the airspace change progress, and these windows also expire after a short period. And it can take time to prepare a launch, and there can be also some minor technical delays which will introduce a waiting time, or also we have to wait for acceptable weather conditions, and then if the window passes or expires during a delay, we need to go around again, and then this is a huge cost and also an unnecessary further delay. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Biano?
I would say from our perspective, I mean, the point of contact for licensing or single point of entry into not only the CAA parts of licensing, but also, I mean, airspace and marine licensing, it would be a sensible implementation or sensible suggestion. Further to your point on the invoking the strategy and the term space SAR, I think from our perspective, we tend to look at these things a little more holistically possible. It's about the UK making the most of the effort deployed here, if I can put it in those terms. We feel very strongly that the point of us being in the UK is not just to come in and execute a launch and then leave again. It's the wider socioeconomic impacts that we can generate locally also from being present in the UK. And it goes, I mean, far and wide in terms of what those impacts are. So we are locally in the forest just outside Inverness, and we picked that location for a number of reasons, specifically because you have proximity to test sites, you have proximity to strong industry partners, you have proximity to the launch site eventually. And you have the entire benefit of the UK supply chain that we are leveraging very heavily. So these deeper benefits, you only really gain those by the implementation of a sovereign capability, if we can put it like that. And this is where we see our role in the UK space side really coming full circle, is that we are able to provide this end-to-end capability that also will serve to increase the capability of the wider community. So
Okay.
we will, stimulate spin-offs, stimulate startups, and other outputs.
Thank you. I suppose one last final question, if I may, which is the purpose of these sessions is to gather evidence and to make ultimate recommendations to government. Is there any one single thing that you would like to be front and centre in our report back to government that they can try and address? Yes.
Well, if I can add at least one point that I think is critical also from our perspective and again I'm going to refer to this vertical integration situation that we face, and that is very much related to the talent pool in the UK. So we are very stringently trying to acquire UK engineering base and UK technicians and UK staff wherever it's practical and possible, and preferably local staff. But we also do face limitations in certain areas, specifically related to launch vehicle development and propulsion systems, which is not something that the UK has pursued for many years. And then we are forced to bring in that type of headcount from abroad. Naturally, that comes with an overhead on visa fees that is considerable, but also it doesn't give the full benefit of what we could be doing in the UK. So from my perspective, one thing to bring forward is that initiatives to stimulate university level graduates or aerospace technician development in this sector would go a long way. You have to appreciate the position that the public funding made available here is being geared quite heavily, at least in our case, with private funding, more than a 1-to-5 ratio. And we are, moving a lot of people into the sector, but we have to bring them out of other sectors. So to be able to sustain growth and develop a sustainable capability long term, we need more talent.
Brilliant, thank you. Mr. Cobalt, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think so. The UK SA overall has been very encouraging, and there are a lot of initiatives that are positive for UK launch industry. And also I think it's notable that the UK National Space Strategy launcher is currently in number 1 in the 10-point plan, which is also encouraging for us. I also wanted to mention before actually that High Impulse also has a UK subsidiary, which we established I think also 2 years ago already, which is basically involved in the testing, and also we have an office space in Edinburgh with engineers working there. And then maybe back to UKSA, there is the Spaceflight Phase 2 plan, which would procure launches and payloads from small launchers. And so this would help, on the one hand, the satellite industry to build satellites and plan launches, and also give some incentive for the launch providers like us to do the launches. And I think last December this program was put on some hold, and it would be good to continue this. And then it would be also helpful, of course, to establish UK's future role in the new space industry as global player. And I think that concludes.
Excellent.
Thank you. Tracy Crouch wanted to come in.
Dr. Cobber, I just wanted to follow up what Dr. Riano said about the talent pool. And I wonder, given you have a UK subsidiary, do you have any comments or views on the talent pool that is available to you, and what more perhaps we need to do to encourage expansion of that pool?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there is quite some talent available. So for us, I can say we are an international company. We have a lot of different employees from all over Europe, but also some international employees. And we've also, of course, employees from the UK, and our employees working in Edinburgh are also locally there. So overall, I think this new space movement basically is also a good advertisement, and the satellite launches and all the infrastructure around. Frank Strang mentioned before that there will also be tourism that will be allowed to take part in the launch campaigns. So it's interesting from that point, and also, of course, it's a high-tech area that we are working in, which is, I think, attractive for many young people, and this will help grow further the new students to go into these STEAM studies also.
Do you have any challenges with visas or anything for talent coming here? A smile. Are there any sort of kind of immigration or visa issues for your staff, your international staff?
Yeah, it's sometimes a long process, yeah. But
so we have the Minister coming on later. It could be a potential area that we could explore with the Minister.
Yeah.
It's a long process. Is it a reliably successful? Do people come out at the other end, or are you frustrated that you don't get the people that you need to have for your operation?
No, I think we can get the people, but they are, like it was mentioned, for some internationals, the visa process can take some time. But this is actually what we experience also in Germany, and it's.
Thank you, Tracy. Can I just ask a final question to Dr. Biano, building on something that Dawn Butler asked at the beginning. You talk about a low-carbon launch model for Orbex. Now, we don't think of space launch as being particularly environmentally sound in terms of the fuel that's consumed. Tell us a bit about the low-carbon aspect and how it compares with other launch systems.
Yes, the interesting element is that it doesn't really compare to other launch systems, because basically most of the existing systems use either solid fuels, kerosene-based fuels, or in extreme cases also anoxic fuels, and all of these creates emissions when they are burned, and those emissions are put in the atmosphere and essentially create what's known as the carbon umbrella, and will have detrimental effects on the environment. But it's wider in the sense that it also makes our ground operations relatively benign. So ours is a biopropane, meaning it's fully road transportable. It's easy to store. If you spill it, it doesn't seep into the ground and create hazards or contamination over time. And all in all, you end up with a vehicle that becomes operationally very versatile, but also has a very benign carbon footprint, both in its creation and in its operation. And that we don't really see many of those out and about in the industry. And we also see it as a commercial differentiator, and we see customers picking up on that element very well, mainly because of the ongoing clean space initiatives that sort of, in their infancy across the European Space Agency and other agencies across the world, but it's the direction in which the world is moving. And we were just fortunate to pick a solution that allowed us to move first.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. It's been very useful to hear from two of the companies involved. So thank you, Dr. Bjarno, and thank you, Dr. Cobble, for your evidence today. We're now going to move on to our third panel of witnesses. And joining us in the committee room is Colin MacLeod, who is the head of space regulation for the Civil Aviation Authority, the CAA, has been referred to much this morning already. And joining us virtually, I hope, we have Rob Bishton, who is the Joint Chief Executive of the CAA. And just in time, we have Mr. Bishton. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Thank you both. You'll have heard, I'm sure, the evidence that we've heard this morning and also in our previous session. And you've obviously got pretty good reviews from the witnesses this morning, but also perhaps a bit of a challenge. We heard evidence from Mr. Strang that it's very important that the license is available within a few months. I think 3 months, he said. Perhaps starting with Mr. Bishton, is that a realistic time frame for them to be aspiring to?
Well, good morning, Chair and members of the committee, and thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to talk to you today. Representing the CA and in my role as the Interim Joint Chief Executive. I'm actually in Glasgow today at a board meeting, so apologies I couldn't be there with you. But yesterday, having come up to Scotland, I met with the Scottish Transport Minister. Space was on the agenda, so to Mrs. Moynihan's reference to previous newspaper articles, definitely not science fiction, definitely about scientists and innovators throughout the UK and in Scotland. I met with Sky Aura yesterday afternoon in their test facility as well, and they were able to describe to me the progress that they're making, and also the connections to academia up here in Scotland to various academic institutions. So I think a really positive trip for us as a board to Scotland on space. I think the references and feedback you've received from witnesses to date shows that the CA has listened, made a lot of progress, and is still looking to make improvement about the regulatory process. Clearly, to your question, the point comes back to that of speed. And the basis of obviously progress when it comes to speed is largely around, the understanding of the regulatory process, and we've spent a lot of time making sure that we are better able to describe that for applicants so that submissions are dealt with in a timely manner. Clearly, there's a lot of reference made to the speed in other regulatory jurisdictions, but we have to look at national interest, we have to look at national security, we have to look at ground hazard, airspace and environment very much through the UK lens, as you would expect, I'm sure, the regulator too. So Colin might be able to comment specifically on the state of progress with regards to Mr. Strang's organisation's application, but I think his feedback, Mr. Balance's feedback, and those of other witnesses today has been very balanced, very fair. We accept the challenges and indeed some of the areas where it's been indicated improvement could be made. For instance, the coordination role across numerous agencies when it comes to these applications. But today, you know, we feel we're aligned with the aligning with the 10 key points in the UK's strategy to make sure that the UK is open for business, to Mr. Strang's very clear point, and that progress to date since July 21, when we took over this role, we have 343 licenses now approved. We have 763 British satellites in low orbit constellation, which is the second biggest constellation of satellites, the OneWeb satellite constellation. We've got 25 active applications in progress in the UK. So I think, Chair, and hopefully members of the committee, referencing previous discussions, we've shown that we've responded to a lot of that challenge, and we've taken on board the current challenges that are being tabled by, I think, an industry now that is very, very good at articulating what it needs, and hopefully a regulator that's clearly attuned to listening to that.
Okay, thank you for that. We can hear you clearly, but you're a little faint, so I'm going to ask if our technical colleagues can turn up the volume in the room a bit. But to Mr. MacLeod, you heard the evidence in the previous session, and there seems to be good engagement between the partners. But obviously, part of that is coordinating your expectations in terms of timeframes, and if people are operating to a completely different expectation than you think is realistic, that is not very productive. So what's your response to the suggestion from Mr. Strang that actually a 3-month or so licence window is what they need?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Committee, and thanks to the previous speakers. It was very good to hear the feedback, and as Rob said, we have been developing and changing how we approach things, and I think the evidence from the previous speakers has also indicated that hopefully we're on an upward trajectory of improvement across all of these activities. I think in terms of timing, there's a few aspects there which are worth bringing to the attention of the committee. The first is that in the time that we've been the regulator, we actually haven't caused any delay to any space operations, whether at launch or satellite, since we started. And indeed, from Rob's comment there, we've actually signed off another 2 licenses yesterday, so we're now at 345 licenses. That's not to say we don't want to make them better and improve the pace. Frank earlier mentioned also some of the ambitions or the timescales that industry put forward. Sometimes the public deadlines or public announcements for launch can be well ahead of when they actually really are technically ready. And even in the last 6 weeks, we've seen 4 significant failures in space. The SpaceX one was very high profile. We also saw a rocket from Sweden that was launched and accidentally landed in Norway. And we saw a new rocket in America from Relativity Space also have anomaly in its first launch. 90% of first launches are failing still. That just shows how incredibly difficult this is. And to add to the complexity of this, from the evidence you've heard today, including last time with Virgin, you've talked to 3 different rocket manufacturers. One uses jet fuel and not liquid oxygen, one uses solid fuel, and one uses a new eco-friendly fuel. They all have different navigation systems, different engines, different propulsion, so they're all very difficult and complicated things. But in terms of the application for Saxiford, it's not right for us to talk in detail about what their application is or where it is at the moment, but we don't foresee a particular problem as we sit here today of being able to launch that, license that in the summer, assuming all the tests can be met. And again, that would be ahead of the readiness of the rockets. And what we're trying to do in the CA is also balance the requirements of all the applications that we have. So, for example, in the last week, we've just managed to license in a very short space of time a very experienced UK satellite manufacturer who had their deadlines shifted by their launch company by 6 to 8 weeks unexpectedly. We were able to move things around to meet that, which caused some pauses in some of their applications, but it's not stopping the actual operations or the technical readiness of those companies.
We'll take some questions from colleagues, but I think it's worth putting on record that you perform a very important regulatory role, and this committee, were a launch to fail in a way that was a result of a failure of regulation, would have some very severe questions, and we know that you have to balance that against the understandable sense of urgency that commercial companies and indeed the public have for launch, and we very much respect that, and I don't think we would expect you to make specific commitments on timescales about a particular application, but we've heard Mr. Strang's aspirations on that. Let me go to Aaron Bell first, and then Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both. Could we just go back to the Cornwall Spaceport failed launch again? I know we had Sir Stephen Hillier and Tim Johnson from you in the session on the 1st of March, and there was quite a bit of follow-up from other witnesses, yourselves and so on, in writing to the committee after that. Can you provide us any further updates on the lessons learning activities that have taken place at the CAA since the failed launch? I don't mind which of you answers that, who's best placed to do that.
I'm happy to start, Chair, if that's okay.
Yes.
Indeed, thank you.
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me a little bit more clearly now. Look, I think that particular event, the scenario leading up to it, provided a lot of learning opportunities for us as the regulator, particularly in terms of engagement, and particularly when you have an organisation that is used to one regulatory regime, but obviously has to then submit an application to fit in with a different regulatory regime. And as I touched upon, there are things that you can't take credit for, no matter what your collaboration is, in this case with the FAA as a regulator. So I think we did maximise the knowledge and information exchange with the FAA. I do think that there were things that were specifically to be looked at by us as the regulator for the UK through that national lens. As I said, you know, national security, interest issues, ground hazard, particularly with the Cornwall launch. As you can imagine, that was a very, very different set of situations that had to be assessed by the team. And clearly airspace. There was a lot of interactions with Portugal, Ireland, and indeed Spain on making sure that the airspace aspects were managed and the maritime aspects. And I do think that we've got to recognise that whilst we've got a dedicated space team in CA 48, we did actually enrol most of the rest of the organisation. I mean, one of the learnings for the CAA is that with a particularly complex activity that is a singular activity, to Mr. Strang's point, it does consume a lot of the organisation. So one of the learnings for us was how do we balance off the broader sector interests and those interests of other applicants. So that was definitely a key learning. But trying to simplify and clarify through engagement what we expect in our regulatory regime. I don't think the question was around actually should be the fitness of purpose of the Space Act or the framework we're working within. It is more around the understanding of the applicant and indeed our team's approach to processing those applications. I do think we also learned a lot about precedents, as in where you set conditions within licensing. So the conditions precedents that you set within licensing, I think we've learned for particularly complex operations, you can still move to approve the license. That doesn't necessarily mean launch, but what it does is it means the regulatory process has been complete, and you place then the onus back on the organisations, in this case Virgin Orbit, Cornwall Spaceport, and you ask them, you monitor them in their undertaking then of post licensing. So I think there was a lot of learnings around that. And I think another point we learned from, which came out from previous witnesses today, was the coordination across multiple agencies: HSE, UK Space Agency, Ofcom, Environmental, Maritime, Office of Nuclear Regulation. I could go on. And there's a key opportunity for us all within this system now to make sure that that coordination role, whether it's with the CAA or not, but it's clarified for the sake of applicants and for ultimately speed of decision making. Colin may wish to build.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. You said that you have learned lessons about resourcing, essentially, about the needs of one particular applicant against the space sector more generally, and presumably against your other duties in the CAA, and how you balance all of that. Are you sufficiently resourced, do you think, now to support the nascent space industry in the UK?
Well, I hopefully the evidence given by witnesses talks to the very clear and active engagement that we have now ongoing across a number of stakeholders, and particularly those with more mature applications. There's a dedicated team of 48. We're very well funded by DFT to maintain that core team. But I think what we should see as a benefit of the CAA having this role is that we are able to enrol the rest of the organisation. And the airspace team in the CAA is 3 times as big as the space team. And the airspace team were really involved in this. The flight ops team is 3 times the size of the space team. And the flight ops team were involved, particularly because of the platform being a 747 and departing from also, whilst a spaceport, a licensed aerodrome. Indeed, our airworthiness team, which again is over 3 times as big as the space team, was enrolled in making sure that their knowledge and expertise in terms of the operation of the 747 was used. So I think to answer your question, we have a great ability to flex and the organisation into supporting space, not just obviously the dedicated space team, which we would grow if needs be, but at this point in time, we believe we have the correct resourcing.
Thank you. Thank you. If I could just turn to Mr. McLeod.
Indeed.
Sorry, we lost you for a moment there, but I think we got the sense of the answer. If I could turn to Mr. McLeod in the room, if somebody else wanted to repeat basically what Virgin Orbit did with a 747 horizontal launch, would they be subject to exactly the same tests for the license and the criteria that you put in place around that launch, or would it have evolved from the learning from that launch?
The tests remain the same.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're asking if Virgin came back in another form, we can, depending on the contractual arrangements and the setup of the company, the license could be transferred,
yes,
or it might need to be reapplied for. So a number of the tests, for example, around finances, the skills and expertise of the people in the organisations, mm-hmm, and prescribed rules and law like the security manager, if they all change, obviously we have to revisit it. But if the fundamentals were the same in terms of the safety case, that will also, and the new organisation's access to that will make it a bit easier for them, because the Virgin Orbit licence is still extant, the Spaceport licence is still extant, but they're also very closely aligned, those 2 licences. And to go back to the original question about the lessons learned, I think just to expand on what Rob said, a really key learning for us is the interaction between the spaceport and the operator. And the launch application down in Newquay is very closely iterated between those 2 companies. And this morning you heard about Shetland, who are looking to have a multi-user spaceport where it's a spaceport with up to 7 companies potentially. And then you've got Orbex, which is 1 spaceport and 1 space company. So the interactions of how that works is really important, because the responsibilities between the spaceport operator and the launch operator can be slightly different on their contractual arrangements. And just to close off, a final key learning was actually on why the accident happened. Mm-hmm. We don't know the actual result formally yet, so the Space Accident Investigation Agency, which is an arm of the AAIB in the UK, is working with the FAA. We understand Virgin have just about closed off the report on what did happen, and when that is sent to the FAA and we have access to it, we'll be able to understand what that means, and that could also have an influence on the ability for a future operation using that same technology, because it depends what the cause was and what the solution is, and that will impact on the safety case they need to get the licence to launch again in the UK.
Thank you. Just finally on that safety case, as I said earlier, we had other companies write in support of your position and your role before that launch. One of them was Newton Launch Systems, who said you're taking the correct approach to safety, but they also raised two concerns. One about the proximity of the spectators to the launch site, just in the very unlikely event of any explosion happening on the ground, and secondly, on the actual launch site chosen was too close in their view to the Canary Islands, an unnecessary risk. Do you recognise either of those, and do you have any observations on their comments?
I think I would respond to that in terms of the way the regulatory system works is that the operator and the spaceport come to us and set out the safety case to us. We don't tell them how big it should be, where they should operate, or how they need to organise their flight path. They set out a safety analysis for us, and our team of experts look at that. And actually, in the case of the Virgin launch, which required an FAA licence as well, we had excellent support from our partners in America. We were able to compare our assessments with the FAA assessments. And in terms of the ground operations at Newquay Airport, while it's space, it's very similar to other high hazard industries which we understand well in the UK. Mm-hmm. And the safety exclusion zone that was put in place and proposed by Spaceport Cornwall, in our view, met the requirements. The mitigations that they put in place were adequate, and that's how we were able to issue a licence for their operation.
And the point where it took off from in mid-air, the launch being too close to the Canary Islands, is that again, you assess that with consulting with the FAA as well?
The FAA undertook their assessment, we undertook our assessment. We had a lot of support from the airspace team in the CAA. We organise corridors of safety for aircraft regularly. This is a normal tactical activity that takes place often in international space, and it was also a good exemplar of how the CAA works with its international counterparts in Spain, Italy and Ireland to coordinate those activities. And to go back to the comment from, I think it was the chair at the start, in terms of failing safely, we set up, we agreed the corridor of airspace, and that was to allow the activity to fail safely. It did fail, and it failed within parameters, and there was no risk to aircraft because of the safety zones that were put in place.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Thank you very much indeed. Just on that point of shared airspace with other countries, obviously that was a bespoke solution for the Virgin launch, and you work very hard with neighbouring jurisdictions. Is it possible, and do you think it's desirable, to establish a framework agreement with neighbouring states that may be useful for future launches without having to negotiate each individually each time?
Yes, and that's under discussion and underway at the moment. So there's two aspects to this. I talked about the tactical elements just now in terms of the CAA and other regulators internationally managing how it happens. The layer above that is the political comfort to undertake these activities in partners' airspaces. And that's where it's slightly more complicated, and that's something that the government leads on. So the government leads on government-to-government conversations with other states, and the Department for Transport is currently doing that in terms of the airspace requirements for the north of Scotland and Shetland spaceports.
And is there a...
Chair, may I build on the airspace point?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, Mr. Bishop, carry on.
Yeah, because in my substantive role, when I'm not the interim joint chief exec, I'm the safety and airspace director, and I was in the sort of process of swapping sort of notes and formal letters of agreement with my counterparts in the countries where obviously the Virgin Orbit launch touched. I think your question around what's the future opportunity to sort of regularize that relationship is one that we are working through, to Colin's point. However, I think it's really important that the committee notes that a lot of the basis by which those other countries, both from a safety perspective and also a political perspective, agreed to support the activity was on the basis of the confidence they had in the UK's assessment of safety and the mitigations. And that was expressly made clear to me by every one of my counterparts that I eventually had to swap formal notes with, that it was their confidence in the risk assessment methodology of the UK and the fact that they know we are very used to managing, organising and approving very complex activity in our airspace, which is by definition a very complex airspace block. So I think there was a lot to sort of leverage in that, but also a lot to lose. So if you don't do that well, if you don't do that rigorously, that confidence goes. And politically, it's very easy, therefore, for that collaboration to stop if they have that justification. So I think it's something we need to protect very clearly.
Indeed. And so on that, if there were to be a framework agreement to make permanent what you did in the case of the Cornwall launch, is there a body that would be responsible for that, or is that, in a sense, a series of bilateral discussions between the UK and other countries? And if so, who is the lead? Is it the CAA or is it the Department for Transport?
The lead would be the Department for Transport on the policy position, but in enacting that, it's usually the CAA, the partners, as you can imagine, within the normal airspace system. We have long established and very strong relationships with a number of airspace partners, and those have been renewed and refreshed post exit from the EU as well. So those relationships are very strong and very productive and very collaborative, and space is just an activity within the broader airspace piece. So I don't think we should say it's different. It's just a question of maintaining that strong framework and those relationships and information exchange with those bordering countries.
I see. Thank you very much indeed. Go to Chris Clarkson and then Tracy Crouch.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to talk a bit about licensing. In the previous evidence session, the committee heard from a number of witnesses, including the CAA, that it might be useful to have a central body or a portal. I think Mr. Strang talked about Spacear, which sounds like a Marvel movie, but might not be a bad idea. Have you made any progress in that area? And what steps have you taken to try and sort of centralise that process to coordinate all the people involved in licensing?
So I'm not sure that we said that we were going to do that. We are learning the lessons, as we said, from the first launch. We're operating at the moment with 5 launch companies who are coming forward, and we have also improved how we coordinate with the Marine Organisation, for example, across airspace with the Health and Safety Executive. There's also local geographical impacts around what regulations may or may not be required. So it's not that there's there's definitely not a simple solution to this, but we are working very closely with all these other partner bodies to try and make sure we can get the companies involved earlier with all these regulatory bodies that have to issue licenses which support the space license.
Would you say from that process that you're sort of developing almost a best practice for how these things can be done more efficiently?
We're certainly learning good lessons as are other partner organisations. So some examples that we've got so far is we talked earlier, or a previous speaker talked about the COMA regulations on high hazard activities. So these are well understood regulatory requirements for organisations in those environments. And what we are able to do now more clearly is when a new applicant comes in the door, we can identify for them which organisations we think they need to be speaking to, because ultimately the licences for some of these need to be issued by other regulators under law. We can't issue a COMA certificate or licence. So we can clearly signify and indicate companies where they have to go. Another good example under Virgin was the requirement for an explosive certificate. Most rockets have use explosives to split the stages apart in a controlled way, but obviously there's lots of requirements around how you handle and store explosives safely. So we've got the expertise. We're learning more and more about how to signpost these to new applicants when they come in the door, so they can start that journey themselves, because they have to do it in direct coordination with some of the other legal bodies.
So based on that, do you think you'll be able to meet the sort of the necessary timescales to fulfil our vertical launch ambitions?
So as we sit today, as I said earlier, we haven't failed or stopped one of these activities taking place within the schedule of their technical readiness, as Sir Stephen Hillier said at the last committee. And looking at the timescales of the applications we've got in front of us, we don't see that we're in a position that we're going to stop any of these rocket companies launching when they are technically ready to launch. And our intention and the lessons learned is that, as Rob said earlier, we're really moving to try and increase precedence before launch. And we are not a licensing body, we are a regulator. We want to issue the license with conditions and then move towards much greater levels of oversight. And what that does is it gives far greater control to the applicants to then focus on operating safely. So they can have their license, they'll have a list of things they have to do before they can launch, and we will support and oversee those through to the point of launch. But they decide when they launch, not us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Tracy Crouch.
There's been much consultation around the issue of a variable liability approach. This committee's report on space and satellites recommended that the government should develop proposals for the variable liability approach, and that it should be implemented by June 2023, which is obviously next month. Many of our witnesses have called for this approach to be taken during this committee's inquiry. Sir Patrick Valance's report on the pro-innovation regulation of digital technologies endorsed this committee's recommendation, but the government in its response said that it was finalising its proposal on the variable limit approach, and that it's unlikely to be implemented now until early 2024. Mr McLeod, I just wondered what your views were on that delay and whether or not you could see that there would be a significant continuation of disincentive for investment, which is what some of our witnesses think.
So, in terms of the proposals, that's not led by the CAA, that's led by government. And I think the Minister coming next will probably speak to that, because I think there's going to be some more engagement with industry shortly. In terms of investment, we certainly do not see any reduction or change in investment at the moment. As Rob said earlier, we've got 25 key applications in the pipeline at the moment. We've issued licenses to 19 companies in the last year and a half from across the globe. We're seeing increasing interest from all countries to come to the UK. It's partly because of the regulatory access and certainty that we have. It's also around the stable legal framework in the UK, which encourages the investment to come forward. And I'm sure the Minister will talk about the proposals linking all that to liabilities and insurance. So we don't see any reduction. And to come back all the way to the start of some of the discussions around regulations, the regulations, from our perspective, certainly work. We've now used them in anger in almost every application that they could be used for, but they're also outcome-focused regulation, which means they allow us to handle innovation very, very well, because it's up to the applicant to bring forward their new idea and show us that it's safe. And that's why we have companies like Spaceforge, who were in the previous evidence session, who are coming up with fantastic innovative ideas. We've got lots of new ideas around debris removal, and increasing numbers of constellations wanting to come to the UK, where we're now an acknowledged expert. I've spoken at the United Nations in Vienna on constellations and our expertise of how to regulate them for other countries, and we've been asked to go and speak again next month. So I certainly don't see any reduction in interest in satellites or launch in the UK.
Okay, thank you. Mr Bishton, while we're waiting for the Minister to arrive, can I just ask a completely separate, slightly off-script question, which is that we've heard from other witnesses this morning, but also previously, around the talent
pool, as it were. Now, obviously, the CAA is a technical regulator, and I just wondered, are you seeing challenges to recruitment within the CAA? What can we do in order to improve talent either being developed here or recruited here? Do you have any views or comments on that?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. It's front and centre actually, and I expect it to be when I resume the board meeting shortly. I expect it to be a topic that our board continues to sort of scrutinise and explore across some of not just space, but sort of new novel technologies. The innovation sector. I was recently down in Bristol visiting Vertical Aerospace, which is an advanced air mobility platform, and they were talking to their own challenges of recruitment. But actually, again, a little bit like the story that I heard from Sky Aurora yesterday when I was on site, they are, as an industry, connecting into academic organisations, trying to design courses so that they get a stream of talented young minds into these various emerging sectors. As a regulator, we've been very active in the STEM programme, again supported by DFT. The question is, do we need to do more? The answer is yes. Do we have some skill shortages as it stands based on some of the issues and technical expertise that we need in our system? Yes, we've got some areas that we've highlighted where we need more resilience. Software, battery specialists, propulsion. Propulsion is becoming not just in space, but as you can imagine, with the sustainability challenge that the entire aviation ecosystem has, propulsion is one of the areas where we think we need to do much more quickly. So again, I will be talking to some of the activity and ideas that we've got in our board meeting when I rejoin it in a few minutes.
I'm very grateful for that, for you taking the time. And again, I'm asking this question as a filler for the Minister, who I'm sure will be exceptionally grateful and reward you accordingly. But do you have any issues around diversity in the CAA, and what more can be done to encourage sort of kind of greater diversity within the regulator?
Again, and as an executive committee, we've progressed, the diversity conversation with a lot of focus over the last 2 or 3 years. We're mindful of the challenge, particularly when you're recruiting expertise from a sector where there is a lack of diversity. So you have to have a very long lens on developing, again, working with academic organisations, pathways for young people to be attracted into into sectors. Now we're seeing, in the Bristol area, there is an emergence there, of talent and diversity that we need to tap into, as indeed some of the innovators are directly themselves. It's no different. I think when we engage with the space sector, we're seeing the attraction of being involved in these new sectors is drawing in interest from a whole diverse range of people, ages, genders, ethnicities. We need to make sure, as the regulator, we mirror that. And so we have programs to try and develop that. No, it's not easy. There's no doubt it's not easy. Have we moved the dial, the pace to the scale we would have wished over the last 2 or 3 years? No. What I would say is we have, because we're a growing organisation, as much as a learning one, we have the opportunity to use future growth plans to make sure that actually the net we throw is very broad, and that we give every opportunity for the most diverse set of candidates to be ultimately brought through our recruitment processes, and equally working with industry partners as well. So I would say at the moment, is it a picture that we accept? No, it's not. And there's a lot of challenge again from our board on that very point.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Can I just ask one final brief question to Mr. MacLeod? It's come up several times in this session and in the previous panel of witnesses that the need for a central gateway to coordinate the different agencies is desirable. And Sir Stephen Hillier said that to us as well. who should establish that? Who should coordinate it? Is that within the gift of the CAA, or is that the Space Agency, or is it the Department for Transport?
That's a very difficult question for me to answer, Chair. I think we should always bear in mind that we've only done one launch, so we've licensed one spaceport and one launcher. We're still learning the lessons from that. I would simply hesitate to make too many changes until we've tested them again in a couple of more areas, because, as I said earlier, I think we've improved things significantly on our engagement with the marine organisations, health and safety, and other bodies. Whether or not that would be an immediate help or a hindrance or something else we'd have to learn to do again for the next launch, I'm not sure. But certainly from the lessons we're continuing to learn, and from the next couple of key examples of a vertical spaceport and some launcher vehicles, that might be the time to revisit that question and see, is it worth us actually doing that, given the volume of applications and the variability between the different applications that we get.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there for now, but very grateful, Mr McLeod, for your appearance today, and for Mr Bishop for joining us from Glasgow and for interrupting your board meeting. Thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to welcome our final panel, indeed pair of witnesses to the table, familiar to this committee, George Freeman, the Minister of State in the Department, now the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. Welcome, Minister, and his official Rebecca Evenden, who is Director of the Space Directorate at that department. Thank you very much indeed for coming. This hearing and its previous one were a follow-up to the report that we issued on space and satellites, and it was triggered in particular by the launch in Cornwall that didn't succeed. I think, Minister, you were there at the time. You were at Newquay on the evening, I seem to remember, and you wrote to me and wrote to the committee to express concerns that the evidence that we'd received from Virgin told one side of the story, and that we needed a broader perspective as to what went right and what went wrong. So help us out. What went right and what went wrong with that launch?
Well, firstly, Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to come before you, and I really appreciate this committee's leadership, if I can say, and interest on space policy. It's a fast-growing area, and we're really grateful for the chance to have this conversation. It is our view still, I should just say that space is difficult. We've seen since the January Virgin failure, and I should just say there's a whole series of things that go into a launch. I don't want to pretend the whole mission was a success, but we have got Europe's first regulated licensed spaceport. We did get the launch away from the UK. The first firing went well. The problem was a Virgin problem with their second firing, which I'm sure you've taken evidence on. But since then we've seen JAXA in Japan have had a major problem with one of their launches. Even SpaceX have had problems. So we're in the foothills of a very fast advancing sector, but we remain committed to our strategic commitment that we think over the next 10 years, given the growth in low Earth observation satellite launch, the UK can realistically, and we are realistically aiming to be the biggest launch pad in Europe through a number of sites, 2 important ones in Scotland, which will be the next launch. And so we remain very committed to that. In terms of the specifics of your question, there are lessons clearly to be learned from both from a Virgin point of view, technically, and that's a matter obviously for them. But from our point of view, whilst we're really proud to have got the first spaceport licensed and led, and the regulations we put in place in 2021 were an important part of that, we are aware that there's launch licenses, orbital licenses, spaceport licenses, marine licenses, national, international airspace licenses. We got through all of that. But as part of the regulatory review in the new department, I'm keen to make sure with officials that we learn those lessons as well about how we can make this a more streamlined process without in any way undermining what the public and all of us would absolutely rightly expect to be line one, which is public safety and environmental sustainability.
Thank you. Well, let's come on to that, but it's important to recognise, as the CAA in the last panel said, that the launch failed, but it failed safely, and that is one of the prime responsibilities of the CAA, whatever else is to be said about it. You mentioned the number of different bodies involved, and that as part of your regulatory review, you're looking at how they could be better coordinated or whatever. Tell me a bit about that review. When is it going to conclude? Who's conducting it? And when will its results be available to change the current practice?
Thank you. You'll appreciate, Chair, since I was last before the committee, we have a whole new department, and that has a major part of the Prime Minister's thinking behind creating DSIT, Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, is to make sure we're building a more coherent landscape across government. And as part of our S&T framework, we have set out regulation as one of the key parts of it. And that's both using innovative approaches to regulation, not to race to the bottom, but to use those Brexit freedoms to set standards. And perhaps we can pick up in due course the work that we're planning on to use those freedoms on space sustainability. But it's also about making sure we have a joined up ecosystem. And perhaps I can turn to Rebecca in terms of when we may be able to come out with something. I've got a big announcement coming in the autumn around regulation, and my thinking had been that we might package it up with that. But there's work going on at the moment across the department to look at how we can, basically what the lived experience for the applicant is.
Ms Evenden, when do you expect this consolidation or cooperation between the existing bodies to take place?
I think, as the Minister says, what the regulatory review consists of is a set of different activities looking at different aspects of how we regulate space. And part of that is looking at what we did for the first launch, and there's been a lessons learned process that has been conducted looking at that. That is still just concluding now. But some of that will be feeding into the work that the CAA and DFT are doing, looking at the Space Industries Act and looking at the secondary legislation to see if there's anything in the future that we might want to come back and revisit. The Space Agency is about to publish a consultation on the orbital liability, which I know has been an issue that the committee has raised before and which we've listened to, and which of course was picked up in the Valence regulatory review as well. So there will be a consultation coming out on that shortly, essentially saying that we accept that we do need to do this. We do need to have orbital liability limits in licenses, and working with industry as to how we best do that. And then there's a sort of third aspect of it as well, which is sustainability and how we use our regulatory framework to best drive those ambitions that we've got for a sustainable space environment. So this is the work that we're doing both through the UN, but also domestically with industry to develop a voluntary standard, which we're calling the sustainability mark, which will help us to set standards to enable us to license both launch activities and orbital activities in a way that drives those sustainable behaviours. So all of those things are under this bracket that we are calling the regulatory review, and we would hope to make some progress by the autumn across the base, all three bases.
On this point about bringing together and better coordinating the large number of bodies involved, when do you expect that to be different in terms of the experience of the companies in the sector?
Perhaps I could say firstly, I don't want to tread on my excellent colleague Jesse Norman's toes as Minister for CAA at DFT. He and I, DFT and DSIT, worked incredibly closely together in the lead up to the Virgin launch, and we're working very closely in terms of learning the lessons from Virgin. I think that's the sort of first starting point. Obviously, they lead on the CAA regulatory piece. We're leading more on trying to make sure that the lived experience across the whole ecosystem for applicants is more streamlined and more coherent. And to be honest, we all learnt a lot through preparing Newquay and living through that launch. And we very much hope that the Scottish launches will be rather easier and more streamlined as a result of it. But I'm happy to take the action, Mr. Chair, to come back to you. In my mind, there's an autumn moment where we're going to be setting out our sustainability specific regulatory proposals for the sustainable kite mark, for accelerated licensing, cheaper insurance, but cheaper finance for compliant companies. And at that point, I would certainly want us to have completed that. So perhaps I can come back to you then.
We've heard throughout our main inquiry and the follow-up inquiries just what pace there is in the sector, and that other companies are advancing quickly. And Minister and indeed Ms. Everton, you both know this very well. So we do need to get on with it. Is it not possible to make some early progress on this before the autumn? You don't need to wait to hold things back for a big announcement, do you, if you've made some progress already?
No, with respect, I think we are moving at a pace that, space is moving quickly, and having come back from the G7, I tell you, we're winning plaudits for the pace and leadership we're providing on sustainability, on European launch, on insisting on international global collaboration. So if we can come back more quickly, we will, but there are some quite important, both across government, but also international pieces that have to be sorted around making sure that, in terms of the sustainability piece, that links to UN, it links to pulling other countries along with us. I've been building a consortium of space nations around the world who agree with us so that we're not isolated on this. So there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, but I absolutely take your challenge, and if we can come back to you with the proposals on this regulatory lessons learnt, we'll do so before the summer.
Thank you very much. Finally, for being specifically on the Cornwall launch, obviously that was a great disappointment to everyone. What steps is the government taking to make sure that the lessons that were learned, and in particular the progress made at Spaceport Cornwall, and we were very impressed by the evidence that we heard from Spaceport Cornwall, it would be a great shame if that did not succeed in the future. Are you able to do anything, Minister, to make sure that Spaceport has a future, with or without Virgin?
Yes, we are, and I completely agree with what you said, and I'll pass to Rebecca to just brief you on the specifics of that piece of work. But we see Spaceport Cornwall as, it's a flagship spaceport. It's the first licensed spaceport in Europe. It is now, as a result of the Virgin launch, receiving it's in a number of important conversations with other launch parties, both here and around the world, who want to consider it as a base for launch. Indeed, I've just come back from Japan, where JAXA said, look, we're very keen to pursue JAXA launches from the UK. So there's a raft of ongoing launch conversations that I'm delighted Newquay Spaceport are having. They are a commercial organisation, and I pay tribute to their energy and pace. And as well as, in this interim period, while the next launches are sorted, they have rightly and impressively set up their Enterprise and Innovation Hub. And at the heart of that Cornish space cluster, with Goonhilly down the road, Earth observation, coding, we see them not just as a launch centre, but a hub for the commercial small companies that are emerging in this space. But I'll pass to Rebecca to talk you through the specifics of what we're doing.
Thank you. Just briefly, if you would, Ms. Evan, because we've got other things we want to go on. But what are you doing to make sure that Cornwall continues as a spaceport?
Well, two main things. The UK Space Agency continues to work with Spaceport Cornwall to help identify any future launch providers that might wish to launch from there. For example, there's a new MOU that the Spaceport signed with Sierra Space in order to, perhaps bring Sierra Space to use Cornwall's facilities. So that's a positive development. And then the other thing Minister's already mentioned is supporting Cornwall through the broader clusters funding, so that they can develop the cluster as a whole and be an attractive place for space businesses to come into. So those are the two main strands.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Let's go to our colleagues, starting with Aaron Bell and then Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, and Ms. Everton as well. If I could just follow up a couple of follow-ups from the Chair's questions. You talked about the progress at Spaceport Cornwall not being wasted. Is the department taking any interest in the what's happened to Virgin Orbit itself, which is currently going through bankruptcy and protection in Delaware, I understand, and is hoping to sell its assets perhaps to Strato Launch? has the department taken any interest, the government taken any interest in what's happening there, and trying to secure essentially the company not being broken up, so that they could get back whoever purchases it to Cornwall as soon as possible?
Yes, we have taken a close interest, but let me just stress, from the point of view of recognising Virgin as a private company, it's a commercial operation, it's up to them to decide how and where they fit in this fast-moving global race. We are keen to make sure that we develop and we deliver our obligation, which was our commitment, which is to make the UK a leading LEO launch destination for all and every and any providers who want to come here. So we are keen to make sure that every opportunity for maintaining value in the UK is pursued, but we're not sitting here, thinking of making a major acquisition and acquiring and developing a UK sovereign launch capability.
Understood. Given we heard from the CAA the licence is still extant for Virgin to launch there, has anyone sought any undertakings, any potential purchasers of Virgin Orbit's assets, have anyone sought any potential undertakings from the government or from the CAA about the fact that licence would be transferable to anyone who purchased the company?
Well, as I said, matters for the CAA would have to be addressed really to DFT and my colleague Jessie Norman as the Minister. I'd just say as Minister for the space industry here, we stand ready to support a specific proposal that looks sustainable, financially sustainable and commercially sustainable. But we're not looking or in the business of making a major UK investment in acquiring a platform that hasn't worked. But we're keen to make sure we support people who want to build and grow here in the UK.
Thank you, Minister. And just on the overall regulation point and the desire that we've heard to have a central entity or portal, Dan Hart, the CEO of Virgin Orbit, listed, and I will list them quickly because it's of interest and I think should be on the record, the different organisations they did have to deal with: Civil Aviation Authority, the UK Space Agency, Department for Transport, Health and Safety Executive, Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, Marine Management Organisation, UK Hydrographic Office, Coast Guard, the Maritime Rescue Coordination Centre, the Ministry of Defence, National Air Traffic Services, Cornwall Police, the Airport Fire Department and MI5. Now, they've all got a valid interest here, and I'm sure your excellent new department has an interest as well, so they maybe could be added to the list. But he said that it's not just the fact that you had to deal with these, it's they were being asked for the same information rehashed again and again. You've said that you want to put that right. Yeah. Would that be a separate organisation, or would that be something that sits with the CAA in your vision?
Well, firstly, yes, and that's why in my opening remarks I made the point that it is no mean feat to achieve first launch from Europe, and there are a lot of lessons to be learned, and one of them that I wanted to highlight was that regulatory alignment. Each of the organisations you've mentioned, I think, do have a role and have an important statutory duty, and we need to make sure that the public can see we are not cutting any corners and that we're doing space launch in a sustainable and safe way. But inevitably, the first time you do something, you're breaking new ground, and there's a lot of lessons about how we can do it more quickly next time and how we can not repeat and not duplicate without in any way undermining different statutory obligations. So, as per the earlier question, Minister Norman and I are keen to make sure that across the board we've got a more streamlined system, it's easier, and people aren't asked the same questions again. And it shouldn't be beyond the wit of government when we've asked a set of questions. This goes across into other sectors like health as well. When you've asked somebody a set of questions, you should be able to capture them digitally and use them in the next application rather than require them to keep giving you the same information. So at a very basic level, we really ought to be able to make it more streamlined.
You think that would be a central government function rather than the CAA? Because you probably caught the last answer as you came in from the CAA. I think they're a little reluctant to take on that clearinghouse role, given that they want to specialise in what they do best.
We don't in any way want to undermine the statutory duties of each regulator, but we do want to make sure that for the point of view of applicants, the system and the process is more streamlined and clear, and that should be possible in a 21st century.
And that could be provided by DFT or DSIT as a government function?
Yeah, we view it as an important part of delivering the S&T framework, the balance review, smarter, more digital and agile regulation in the global race. So it's a cross-government responsibility.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Chris Clarkson and then Rebecca Lombardi.
Thank you, Chair. Sir Patrick Vallance has endorsed this committee's recommendation about moving towards a variable liability system by June of this year. The government's indicated now that it's looking at doing this perhaps in early 2024. Obviously, I know from my own experience working with you, Minister, you're a doer and you're trying to make this a lived experience more accessible for people. So will you be taking any steps to expedite that process? And what steps will you be taking in order to ensure the competitiveness of the sector?
Yes. As Rebecca just said, we had taken the advice that we'd heard via this committee and others, and we've made the move and the commitment to address it. Perhaps I can invite Rebecca to explain the timetable and any options for accelerating it.
Well, the consultation is being led by the UK Space Agency. We want to leave enough time during that consultation for industry to respond so that we actually get the right answer here. So I think you could expedite it, but actually you probably need a bit of time for the industry, for the insurance community to think about what they want to say. And I think if the consultation is being published next month, which I believe is the aim, and will close, I think, at the end of September, then a couple of months after that for the government to publish its response in early 2024, I think is a fairly reasonable timeline for what will be quite a significant policy change for the government. And I think once you've signalled that this is what you intend to do, that is the important thing, and businesses will take that signal positively, at least that's what we're hearing from industry, and be able to make their investment decisions based on the signals that they're hearing from government about the direction of travel.
We do plan a major moment, as I mentioned, in October, where we'll be setting out the detail of our new sustainability regulatory framework. We've got a working group with Lloyd's of London, the City of London, Space Agency and DCIT officials. We do intend that to be quite a moment where the UK sets out a new regulatory framework that rewards those that are compliant with quicker access to financing, cheaper insurance, and if we can do it, speedier regulatory approval. So this all goes to a piece, and I think without compromising the importance of industry having a clear voice, if we can get it out before the end of Q4, it might, it's all to the good in terms of showing leadership in a new regulatory framework.
So, I mean, obviously, the lawyer in me is slightly cynical, so when I see a phrase like early 2024, I have to ask, what is early 2024? But if you're saying now possibly by Q4, is this just a case of making sure the due diligence is done before anything sort of goes out?
Yes, there's no reason to hold it back, and every reason, I think, as long as we've had proper consultation from industry and it fits with that package that we've announced in October. We don't want to give contradictory signals. If I could, I would love to get it away by the end of 24, and if it means the end of 23, and if it means early 24, I'm thinking first week of 24 rather than Q1 takes us through to Easter.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and then Tracy.
Thank you, Minister. The government has continued to delay the publication of a national position, navigation and timing strategy. That's a capability that's critical to UK infrastructure. Can you confirm whether a strategy will be published and what the timelines for this will be?
Great question. Yes, I can confirm that. You'll appreciate, Ms. Longbailey, the scale in the last and the pace in the last year of international geopolitical interest in PNT. We've seen since the appalling invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, just in the last 12 months, a huge geopolitical race for access to and integrated approaches by allies to some of that PNT technology and data. And so there's a huge amount going on. Indeed, it was an important topic at the G7 where we were frameworks for integrated commercial data use in space that also allow for proper secure use and security uses by trusted allies and partners. So it's very live, and it's something that we are discussing in the Economic Security Cabinet committee that the Prime Minister's set up. Perhaps I could turn to Rebecca for, again, timings and likelihood of when we expect to be able to put something up.
Yes, I can comment, although the PNT team doesn't sit within my remit, so it sits within a parallel team within DCIT. That's because the government took the decision to establish a cross-government approach to PNT. That was the significant step, I believe, that was taken last year. So rather than this being the remit of a single department, which meant that progress was quite difficult, other departments came together to form a single unit to look at both terrestrial and space interests in PNT and the use cases. And I know that team has made good progress over the past few months and have concluded their demonstrator project. And recommendations are going to ministers at the moment to conclude that and to set out next steps. So I think subject to all of that, I would hope that you would hear from the PNT team, within not a very long amount of time, what those next steps are likely to be.
Okay, so are we looking within the next few months?
I would expect so, but as I said, this isn't within my remit at the moment, but certainly I would expect that to be the case, yes.
My note says the project team is in the final stages of assembling evidence for ministers. Well, final stages sounds to me like weeks. I'll happily come back to you, Ms Long-Bailey, on that if I may. It's a helpful question.
Lovely, thank you. And one very brief question. Insofar as the strategy is being developed at the moment, are you aware that it's going to involve the use of OneWeb satellites?
Well, that's another very interesting question. Let me take it from the top. Firstly, the OneWeb's future direction is obviously a matter for OneWeb. It's a business subject to commercial freedom. We are delighted, and I think I've said to this committee before, I inherited our golden share, and if I hadn't inherited it, I'd be sitting here saying, if only we had a golden share in the world's biggest LEO constellation, an independent global commercial business. And I'm really delighted that they've achieved that status with their 672nd, I think it is, satellite. And they're obviously in discussion at the moment with Eutelsat, which is commercial, and I wouldn't want to compromise it by commenting on it, except to say that we do view our shareholding in OneWeb as a major lever for our commercial space strategy. And we are in discussion with, as you'd expect, the various partners in ESA and in the EU. Indeed, I've just been discussing it with European partners at the G7, that we believe there's a very significant win-win here if OneWeb decide through their Eutelsat acquisition that they want to be and can be part of the European IRIS system, then there ought to be enough there to go around for all parties to benefit. We would certainly want to make sure that through our golden share we have a significant piece of manufacturing here in the UK and potentially launch here in the UK. There are some big issues sitting within the EU at the moment around how we make sure that a global and commercial open constellation can also provide the right PNT security. There are technical solutions to that. I shouldn't go any further, but we think it's perfectly possible for the UK to secure our PNT, strategic military and defence PNT requirements with OneWeb as part of a European constellation. The two are not in conflict.
Thank you, Rebecca. On the PNT strategy, we took evidence during our main inquiry that the PNT strategy had already been developed, it had been consulted on within the industry, and yet it still hasn't come to you, Minister. I think it must have been 2021 when we heard that it was being discussed. We've discussed the pace that's required in this. Is there sufficient recognition of the need for pace within the department?
Let me just be clear. In 2021, I saw. I mean, it's not that I'm waiting to see the first documents on this. There's been substantial conversation across government and departments. There's a number who have an interest in this, obviously. What we're waiting for is the final set of proposals for us to agree and sign off.
If you saw the first set of proposals in 2021, it's taking an awful long time to get to the final ones, is it not? What's the problem?
Well, as I commented earlier, so I returned to government at just before Christmas in 2021. You'll be aware 2022 was both a military and politically and militarily tumultuous year. We had war in Europe, we had huge focus in government on dealing with and responding to all of that. We've had some political turmoil, and we've now had the creation of a new department. And
you're saying the creation of the new department has delayed things further?
No, I'm saying that the Prime Minister has made strategic grip of global S&T for the UK in the context of global security far more of a priority than it was back in 21 as a result of Ukraine. Okay. These conversations are very live. And
TNT is very important to the space sector. The space sector is very important to our science and technology ambitions and indeed to the country. So it would follow, I would hope, that the creation of a new department and the appointment of the Prime Minister with these ambitions, way back in the autumn, might accelerate this. And yet here we are in May, and we still don't have the PNT strategy that was referred to in draft in 2021.
Yes, I don't. For the reasons I've set out, I don't accept that is, as it may look to you, a period of inactivity at all. Quite the opposite. It's been a period of extraordinarily intense international collaboration around PNT in the face of an actual security threat, both military in Europe and economic threats to supply chains. And so there are a raft of very strategic conversations going on about our Five Eye Alliance, AUKUS, and how much we need to respond to make sure that key critical supply chains and facilities like this are within secure partnerships with secure allies. So please don't take the lack of the announcement of a strategy with this committee as inaction at all, quite the opposite.
Okay, well, that's very helpful to hear. But you've heard from Ms Everton that something's coming to ministers, and you interpret that from your experience as being weeks. You'd agree with the committee, I hope, that it couldn't in conscience be any more than weeks, given the importance of it and the time that's been taken already.
Well, I can only speak for myself, but yes, but equally the complexity of this, it does cross Ministry of Defence, Prime Minister's Office, Treasury, DCIT. There's a huge number of conversations that have just come out of the G7 around security. So this doesn't sit only with me, but I think I've been pretty clear this is geopolitically and economically important and urgent for clarity in this global race for space.
Okay, and final questions from Tracy Crouch.
Well, speaking of cross-government discussions, the previous Prime Minister disbanded the National Space Council. It was re-established by this Prime Minister, but as an interministerial group. Has it met yet?
Good question. So as the capital SC Space Council, no, it hasn't met yet. And that's for a number of reasons. Partly that space, the creation of the NSTC, which was also disbanded by the last Prime Minister and reinstated by the current Prime Minister, so the National Science and Technology Council, which is the strategic, it's the S&T equivalent of the National Security Council, where we take the big decisions about strategic technologies and sectors. Space has been included in the list of areas where the NSTC needs to, not least for the reasons we've just discussed, lead. And the creation of the new department, with me as Minister of State with responsibility for space, and the department convening S&T across government, has meant that right now we are focusing on delivering the space strategy that we set out in October 21 and the various topics we've considered. It is my view that actually we ought to convene, rather as we do in other key sectors like life sciences. The Life Science Council brings together industry leaders, big, medium and small, political leaders, and I think the Space Council should be constituted as a leadership forum for the nascent and emerging space sector, which isn't quite how it was originally constituted. And I actually personally think it would be a good thing for us to do. But I think first of all we need to deliver some of the key things that we've been talking about this morning. So I would like to see the Space Council up and running and having its first meeting before the end of this year, certainly, particularly perhaps given the announcements we're making in September, October, that would be a good time.
I'm slightly surprised and shocked actually with that response, because I think that this is obviously a thriving industry which government is making a huge amount of. Its value to the economy is enormous. The supply chain ecosystem is fantastic. It's driving talent and interest from around the world. And you yourself, Minister, have talked repeatedly throughout the session about the cross-government nature of space policy. To deliver a strategy, you need that support from all your colleagues across departments. So for the interministerial group to, by the sounds of it, not even have been populated with ministers, let alone have had a meeting, is, I think, a bit disappointing.
Just on that, to be clear, that's not the case. Sorry, I didn't mean to give that impression. The Space Council, as it was originally proposed, hasn't met. I have regular routine meetings with the Minister for Defence Procurement, who leads at Space. The Chancellor and I, just last week, convened the latest in a series of roundtables with industry leaders in number 11. We have a routine heartbeat series of meetings with Space UK. I work very closely with Minister Norman on the CAA. So there is, I didn't want you to feel that the fact that the Space Council hasn't met it's not the fact that there isn't extremely close cooperation across government.
So, in that case, was the previous Prime Minister right to scrap it? Because it sounds like it...
No, as I said in my answer, you need, in my view, you need ministers to do heavy lifting with their officials across government. Space councils, life science councils provide a different role, which my view is that they're not really delivery boards. They're annual moments where the whole of the sector comes together and looks at the KPIs and looks at the delivery. And I think as we bed in the delivery of this space strategy, we need to make sure that we've got a really coherent system across government with the right people around the table who represent not just the big corporates, but the emerging companies, the SMEs, the investors. And so I would like that Space Council to reflect the new space economy that's taking shape here in the UK.
Time is short, and as much as I'd like to keep probing you on this, I think it would be useful perhaps if you could write to the committee with perhaps the vision for the council, when you expect it to be meeting and what you're expecting it to be doing, because at the moment it doesn't feel like there's much urgency within that. I have one final question just from witnesses this morning, which is around talent, and there was a desire to sort of kind of grow the talent pool, again referring back to the fact that it's a thriving industry. What conversations are you having with Home Office colleagues in order to ensure that visas are being appropriately made available to high-skilled workers that want to come and work in the UK space sector?
Yes, thank you. This is a really important issue, and it's important in our space strategy. It was one of the key elements. It's a really important part of the S&T strategy, where skills, talent and resourcing is one of the essential elements. And that's why I've asked Space UK to provide for us a skills map over the next 10 years of exactly what the jobs are going to be created, what the skills gaps are sectorally and regionally, which we're still waiting for, I believe. Let me pass to Rebecca for the detail on how we look to implement that over the next few years. In terms of visas, you'll have noticed the government set out a number of fast-track visas recently, visas for graduates, for scientists, for entrepreneurs, and one of the reasons that I've asked the Space UK to provide us with that map is that, as with other sectors, we need to make sure we've got the actual numbers, and I think they're going to be quite substantial numbers over the next 10 years, so that we can lock in with Minister Rob Halfon at the Department of Education and make sure that FE and HE colleges are actually providing what's coming.
Before you do pass over, so forgive me, and I know that we've got to go to the Prime Minister's question, but you started your evidence by saying how fast-paced this sector is, how it's moving constantly. We're hearing from witnesses about the sort of kind of global race on this. asking people to go away and draw up a skills map sounds like something that is not very urgent in terms of its deliverables. People are crying out for talent into the sector now. So could I encourage you to sort of kind of go away and reflect on that and reflect on how we're getting people now into UK space?
Thank you. To be clear, I asked in February for not a complicated map, just a list, very basic, practical list of what the UK space sector, led by Space UK, the commercial body, see as the actual skills required, so that we can get into the specifics of what's needed where.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Just one final question from me. You mentioned the Space Council should be looking at KPIs, but there aren't any KPIs. Perhaps this is the reason the Space Council hasn't met, because the space strategy doesn't include them, as we pointed out in our report. In the government's response to our report, it said that it acknowledged the importance of monitoring and evaluating progress, and said a monitoring and evaluation framework is being developed by DCIT. It hasn't appeared. When is it going to?
I've just signed it off, and I turned to Rebecca to confirm when it's coming. It's a very important part of setting out the 10-year delivery plan and how we're doing on it each year.
So we're working towards a publication which will set out how we've made progress against the space strategy, and set out where we're going to go next over the next sort of couple of years.
KPIs, yeah.
And so that will set out, yes, progress and the monitoring and evaluation.
The Minister's just signed it off, so when is it going to be published?
Perhaps I can just say on the KPIs, this is part of a broader departmental focus of mine that I want to see, not just that we've ticked off the things we said we would do in the strategy, but that we set co-investment targets. We show what we're using, how we're turning our 5 billion.
When is it going to be published if you've signed it off, Minister?
Well, we'll wait for the... we have to go to right round, so get collective agreement on it. That will happen very shortly. It's been signed off by ministers in DCIT. Collective agreement, and then we're hoping to get this published before the summer recess. That's our goal.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, Ms Evenden, for your evidence. That concludes this hearing of the committee. Order.